Guys, it's Sam, and these are my most recent reads. This is the second to last most recent reads. My next one will be the final for 2024's reads. So it's crazy. It's crazy. These are books 68 through 77, so I made it to my 75 books in a year goal, which is what I've been sitting at for a long time. But the goal videos will be coming up soon, so you know how I am in January. I love to post booktube content in January, and it's coming. Yeah, let's get into the books, because this little chunk of reading was like some of the best from the whole year. Like bangers, front to back. First is The Witch and the Tsar by Olesya Salnikova Gilmore. I always have to look at this author's name when I am talking about it. And this book I've done a full spoiler-free review on because I love it and I think more people should read it. It is incredibly underrated. I've heard no one else talk about it. This is following the legendary witch Baba Yaga and is kind of a historical fantasy in the same way that the Winter Night trilogy by Catherine Arden is. If you liked that, you'll like this. So this is following Baba Yaga, but instead of being an old crone that we typically see in mythology and things, she is like a younger to middle-aged woman. I think she's like maybe in her like mid to late 30s appearance-wise, but she's still hundreds of years old. So in this lore, she's kind of like half goddess, and that's why she's immortal like this. And she gets pulled into the history in Russia around Ivan the Terrible. So this is 16th century Russia. She is like kind of friends, or her family has been friends with one of Tsar Ivan's wives, like his first wife, I think, and gets pulled into all the political machinations there. So we have this like magical stuff going on. We have her getting pulled into political machinations over a long time. This is all the elements that you would want from like a Baba Yaga story. There's sort of some questy type elements to this. She has some magical animal companions. This like folk magic witchcraft element is there too. Like it's not like it's just, oh, she has like goddess ability. She's like doing folk magic. And then we have all of this history and stuff and all these wars that are happening in Russia, because Russian history is rife with conflict. But yeah, this was amazing. Like I said, I have a full review for it. I gave this 5 out of 5 stars and is one of my favorite books of the year. Then we have Mastering Magic by Matt Aaron. This is a book about witchcraft, so I'll be talking about this more on my Patreon, link down below if you want more witchcraft reviews. This is the author of Psychic Witch, which is a book that I have tried to read multiple times and have never gotten through because it is so exercise intensive heavy. Like it has a lot of like meditation-y type exercises that you can do. So next year on my Patreon, I will be actually hosting like a book club thing, working through that book throughout the whole year, because again, kind of like a deep dive into that book, again, if you're interested in that. But this I will talk about more in depth on my Patreon, but it is a kind of spiritual sequel to the first book, but this is about actually like crafting spellcraft. I tabbed it up quite a bit. I tend to tab up most of my wishy books, but this has a bunch of different examples of different spells, where the first book had like no spellcraft stuff at all. It was just kind of about like the mental side of things. This has a lot more of like crafting spells, and he also pulls in spells from friends that like contribute to this. Yeah, and this was really good. So I will talk about this more in depth on Patreon. But I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. Need to take a boba break. I haven't had boba in so long, and I was going through withdrawals. Then I read a book that has been on my shelf for so long, has kind of been this thing semi-looming over me, not in a bad way, but just in a way that it's a book that I know I've needed to read for a while. I've had it on my shelf since like 2018, and that is The Emperor of All Maladies by Siddharth Mukherjee. This book. So this is, it's literally called The Biography of Cancer. It won the Pulitzer Prize the year that it came out, which I think, I don't even remember. It was like sometime in like the 2010s. This book I heard about when I was working in oncology shortly after I myself had cancer. So yeah, like those years, if you've been around a while, that I was working in oncology and hospice and stuff. And so one of the other social workers recommended this book to me, and I've wanted to read it, but it is a chunk. And I was also like, ooh, this is so close to home right now. I don't know if I can. And it's been just sitting on my shelf, mostly because I could read it, but it's just been so chunky, and it's a nonfiction book. They call it The Biography of Cancer because he started writing it. This is a doctor and gene kind of scientist, oncologist. He does a bunch of things. He's massively smart. And he basically said he started writing about cancer, and then it felt like cancer became a character that you were following, with all these sort of side characters of all these people that had a big part in how cancer was researched and talked about, especially in the United States, so that those almost all became like supporting characters. And he's right. The way this is written is so good. I know cancer is a super heavy topic, obviously. This book has everything in it. Like, it obviously has people having cancer and horrible things happening, and like visceral details of different cancer treatments and things throughout the years, like way back like millennia to more modern times. It has child death. It has other people dying. Like, it has stuff, but it also has like this thread of hope throughout, and it is really fascinating, the discussions of like how research happened, how like the story about cancer has changed over time. This doesn't really follow any one particular cancer, but there's definitely a few that seem to be the main focus. He is more of like a leukemia guy, it seems like. So he was doing a lot of his studying around like childhood leukemia specifically, which leukemia specifically just is like its own beast. And then does talk about like breast cancer and things and some lung cancer, but then touches on a few of the other ones and just basically talks about how like cancer itself, which we all know this to be true, but we don't think of it this way a lot when people talk about cancer. I've noticed that like cancer is an umbrella for so many different things, and it's so different, and the way you treat it is so different, and the way that we've thought about it throughout the years and treatment is so different. Like some of the things that used to be the top treatments for things, we found out were like horribly not useful. Anyway, this book is fascinating. You don't even have to be into medical stuff to enjoy this. His writing is fantastic. I also listened to the audiobook, and that was great. But again, he cites all of his sources, like this man is a doctor, recounts centuries of like discoveries and scientific discoveries and things that tie in that weren't even necessarily cancer related to impact cancer. It's really good. It's really, really good. I'm tempted to read his other book, which is about genes, but I don't know. This was just like a magnum opus, and again, sort of has been a thing that's been sitting on my shelf as a part of my life for quite some time. And yeah, it's very, very good. So I gave this 5 out of 5 stars. It's excellent. Even if you're not a nonfiction person, highly recommend this because it almost reads like fiction. Fascinating. Then I read The Mask of Mirrors by M.A. Carrick. This is the first book in the Rook and the Rose trilogy. I'm going to be doing a full spoiler-free review on this, so pay attention for that coming up. Like, I think it's probably going to be my next video or very soon after this. And this is the first book in an adult fantasy series that is taking place in sort of like I would call it like a Venetian-inspired world, but there's other things going on besides that. But it is heavy political intrigue type fantasy with some really cool magic mixed in. So we're following our main character of Ren, and she is a con woman who is trying to con this family. She used to live in this city as a kid. It sort of has like Lies of Locke Lamora vibes in some ways too. So again, if you enjoyed that, I think you would enjoy this. Ren has a similar vibe as far as smarts and stuff to someone like Locke. But she grew up in this town, and in the underbelly of it, went away for a while, found like a mark in one of the like noble families, came back and is trying to basically masquerade as someone that's a part, like a distant relative of this family, to get into this family. Then she discovers that it's like she gets pulled into all this stuff happening with this family that is more than she ever anticipated, and she's starting to like really grow to love this family in a lot of ways, but still wants to take advantage of them. And there's all this stuff. In addition to that, we have a couple other different characters that we're following. There is a essentially like a cop that we are following attached to this family, but he has a bunch of stuff happening as far as like the culture, because this culture is also like a colonized area, and he is tied to that. Then there's this man who's like a crime lord who is very interesting, like as a sort of antagonist foil to her, but also ally. Very intriguing. Again, I'm going to do a full review on this. And then there's a bunch of different magic that is so up my alley, because there's like its own tarot card system and dream magic are like the two that are the major players. And then there's sort of like their high ceremonial magic is like astrology and like sigils and stuff. It's a witch's dream, truly. So this was fantastic. I highly enjoyed this. It is slower at points. It's a lot of, again, like political machinations, political maneuvering stuff, but so many things that I didn't expect to happen, and this is really great. So I'm looking forward to the rest of the series. I gave this 5 out of 5 stars, and again, I'll have a full review, and maybe a gush? I don't know. Then I read Botanical, Curses and Poisons, The Shadow Lives of Plants by Fez Inkwright, which is one of the best pen names I've ever heard. This is a book I've had on my shelf for a while because it is stunning. Like, check out this cover and the end pages. Like, it's beautiful. And this is a non-fiction-y, sort of like witchy adjacent book that just talks about the lives of and like stories behind different again, the shadow lives of plants, basically. Like, different plants, mostly poisonous plants, but not even just poisonous plants, like just plants that have been associated with, like, harm and stuff over the years. And, like, poison, there's a little, like, section in the beginning talking about the history of poisoning and, like, history of sort of witches and things. That is also very interesting, but most of it is just going through a bunch of different plants and their, like, associations and folklore attached to them and all of that, which was very fun and cool. And this was really good timing because I was submitting an idea to my tattoo artist that I'm going to get in January that is a thigh tattoo with a bunch of poisonous plants and a snake on it. So this was like really good timing to be reading. So I really enjoyed this. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. This like isn't one that I will revisit all the time, but it's stunningly beautiful and had some really cool different folklore and things about plants. I then read Babylon's Ashes by James S.A. Corey, which is the 6th book in the Expanse series. And this is essentially a like mid-series finale. I think there's 9 books in total for this, but after this book, there's like a decades-long jump that happens. So this is concluding up a lot of threads in the series that we've had so far. And this one was cool because the book before this that I read recently, Nemesis Games, covered the POVs of a bunch of the people on the ship that we know and love, like some of the main characters. We followed them. This one is following some of them, but then is also just like following a bunch of the characters that we've just known throughout. Some of them that have been POV characters in the past, and some of them that we have just known about. And there are some really good chapters just with these people that we've like known, maybe haven't been in their heads. I forgot to mention this is an adult science fiction series. That's a space opera that is in the far human future in which we have settled on Mars and also the asteroid belt. And in the first book, there is some kind of like alien virus that has been sort of like catapulted in. And so there's like that element, but then there's also just a lot of like political machination stuff. And our main characters get wrapped up in all of that and are like just involved in all of the political machinations all the time. So this, again, concludes a lot of that. And it was so interesting to be in all these characters' heads. There's a lot of things that are wrapped up. There was one chapter in particular of this one character who's basically trying to convince a bunch of different people to follow essentially our main character. And it's one of the best written chapters I've ever read in a book because it just has him just playing everyone where he'll have a conversation with one person. He'll be like, yeah, you can't trust Holden. He's so emotional. And then he'll talk to a different person. He'll be like, yeah, you can't trust Holden. He's too logical. And he just like manipulates by talking to everybody and like pulling on what he already knows about them. It was a very cool chapter. But yeah, it was really fun to see some of these characters that we've been around for a while. And I'm interested to see what is going to happen as we like move decades ahead, because I think we're going to have to start pulling in more of the alien stuff. It's not that that hasn't happened. It's sort of like a Game of Thrones feeling where like you have the White Walker stuff, but everyone's worried about the political stuff. And then towards the end, the White Walker stuff is like, it's happening. I sort of feel like that needs to happen for this. But yeah, so this, as far as like a conclusion to these arcs, was super good. I listened to the audiobook and I really like the narrator. I think his name is Jefferson Mays, I want to say. He does a lot of different science fiction books and I really like his narration style. So I gave this like 4.5 stars. I then read Ruthless Vows by Rebecca Ross. I wanted to finish up some duologies and series that I had going, and this is one that I started this year and I wanted to wrap up this year. The first book being Divine Rivals, which I read earlier this year and really loved. It is following, this is a YA story and is following 2 characters who are like upper YA, honestly. It's like a little bit slightly more mature YA, but it's 2 characters who are working at a newspaper, and they are rivals. And then what our main character Iris doesn't know is that she is writing letters, and she thinks to her brother, and she's putting them away, and they kind of like disappear. And they're actually going to this guy, this rival of hers. And that's what happens in the first book, and like everything kind of takes off from there. And there's like wars between gods happening, and like this, you know, they're having to report on this like god war, but also have all this like interpersonal stuff happening. This book, obviously, I can't say much about because it's a continuation of that. I liked this, but it wasn't as strong as the first book. The interpersonal stuff in the first book is so good. This book focuses more on the god war stuff, and it just, for it being a god war, is just not as like, it's a god war that sort of, it's mimicking World War I, basically. And there were things about that felt like they needed slightly more time. There was things about the gods where you're like, you're being really dumb for like an immortal, all-knowing being kind of thing. And then there was just some stuff about the interpersonal stuff that I think got wrapped up a little bit too easily, but I also would have probably not loved it being like dragged on a ton. I don't know. There's just a few little elements that I think could have been changed. So I overall enjoyed this, but the first book I do think is better. But I think this series overall is very solid, and I see why so many people love it. So I give this one 4 out of 5 stars. Then I reread To Like the Lightning by Ada Palmer. This is the first book in the Terra Ignota series, and this series is so weird. This is a science fiction series that's sort of like a space opera-y, very political, very slow. So this is taking place sort of in the future with a utopian type society where people are broken into, they call them hives, that are just like different sort of value sets and things, as far as like, we're no longer nations, we're like hives, but then there are still kind of nations. And then you have families, but they're not blood related families necessarily. They call them bashes, and they're like sort of chosen families and things. And there's all this like different like tech and things that are wrapped up in this. We're following a person who is an unreliable narrator kind of, or like there are things that you find out about it later in the story that you're like, oh my god, this is our narrator. And he is attached to some almost like godlike figures. I told you this series is weird. I'm trying to explain this in a succinct way, and there's no way to explain it. But he's writing a history of the things that happened over just a course of a few days that blew everything up politically in this world. So yeah, this is very weird. There's a lot of weird things associated with this. But this series is, I'm reading the second book right now. These books are slow. More happens in this book than the second book. The second book is like all conversations, but it's very interesting. And this is basically like a heavily thematic sci-fi story about religion and politics, but not like our religions. It is like a fascinating thesis exploration on like humanity and values and like religion and politics. It is so weird and so cool. Anyway, this series is fascinating. There's like, it's like nothing else I've ever read in my life. So I gave this like 4.5 stars, I think, on reread, probably 4.5 to 5 stars. Like, it is incredibly fascinating. I've been rereading them on audio, and I really like the audiobooks as well. Jefferson Mays, who did The Expanse, read this first one. The narrator's different for the second one, but I also really like him. Anyway, very enjoyable, very weird. If you like weird shit, try this out. Then for House Up Book Club, we read The Deep Sky by Yumi Katase, and this is a standalone science fiction story about a woman who's on a generation ship. And there is some kind of explosion, and it sort of trickles, like, there's this conspiracy on this generation ship because Earth is dying, and they were cryogenically frozen for like 10 years, and then they woke up for a few years essentially just to like get pregnant and have more like babies for later on, and then they are going to get refrozen and then wake up at the new planet. But while they're up, this explosion happens, and it kind of sets off everything. So there's like AI, did the AI do it? There's a bunch of people from a bunch of different nations, and we don't really know how everyone got here. So there are flashbacks to like how people were chosen to be a part of this program. And so then people are like not trusting each other. And so it's sort of like, you know, are we forming this new society? Are we still attached to our Earth ethics? Like, how does the past shape us? Are all these people really special or not? And it's this closed circle mystery because they're all stuck on the ship. This was super fun. I really enjoyed it. It's not something that where I feel like the characters stand out a lot, but the story is so interesting and like so like interestingly done. Some of the things that are brought in as far as like on the ship is not decorated at all. They each have like environments in their head and like a microchip in their head basically that like shows them different environments. So they're all on the ship, but they're not all seeing the same thing, which is like a cool thing to think about. Everyone on the ship is a person who can have a child. So that is an interesting thing. So like many of the people on the ship are pregnant throughout, and we get reminded of that throughout, which is like an interesting element. Anyway, there's a lot of really cool things we talk about in depth on the live show, so I'll link that on the screen if you're interested in more of my thoughts, but I gave this 4 out of 5 stars, and I will read more by this author for sure. And lastly, I listened to Digital Minimalism by Cal Newport. This is kind of a journey that I've been on recently in the last few months. I've talked about this a little bit more on Patreon, again, so if you're interested, that's linked down below, but I have been really cutting back on social media, not so much YouTube, because I don't consider YouTube to be a time sink in the same way as like other scrolly apps are, but I'm completely off of TikTok. I only use Instagram for like art-based things, and I am off Threads and Twitter. So I read this as like a complement to some of that. I am not doing the complete detox that this author recommends, but this just kind of talks about like what all of the social media and like being on your phone and being attached to technology does to our brains, different ways that other people that he's talked to have like shaped their tech usage, because basically his whole thing is not that you need to be off of all of it completely, but can you make it work for your life? And so some of the things that I've been doing as far as cutting that down, again, some of those apps are off my phone, some of those like services I only check from a computer, and I'm still continuing to prune away at that. So if you want a video on that, I can talk about that a little bit more, but again, I've been talking about it on Patreon a little bit more. But yeah, I do plan on doing a video talking about some of the hobbies that I've picked up since decreasing social media time, because when you are not on social media all the time scrolling, you have a lot of downtime. And it's actually good to be bored. So I've been having some other more creative hobbies that I would love to talk about, because it's been something that's been taking over my time way more than scrolling on TikTok, which was eating my brain. Yeah, I really love this. I gave it a 4.5 out of 5 stars. Again, Cal Newport is one of those just like, there's a certain genre of man that writes self-help books that I don't love, and I think he does fall into it, but he's a little bit less patronizing than some of them are. I think some of the things about digital minimalism that he's saying are good, and he does have a lot of science to back like why some of this stuff is bad for your brain, and that solitude is good, and that boredom is good, and like the ways that anxiety has increased with a lot of social media. There's just like a lot packed into this pretty small book. So I definitely recommend it. I gave it 4.5 out of 5 stars, and I'm going to continue to be reading some nonfiction books about this like the way that our focus has been lost because of social media and stuff, because I've noticed a drastic improvement in my mental health since being on some of these infinite scroll apps less. Anyway, that's the way to end things. So those are the books that I've read recently. Again, my very last one for the year will be coming up very soon, in like a couple of weeks. So comment below, let me know if you've read any of these books and what you thought of them. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys soon. Bye.